The cold, sterile air of the galactic warship hummed around the training arena. The polished metal walls reflected the sharp contrast between the dark interior and the bright training lights above. It was a place built for conflict, where elite soldiers from across the universe were put to the test. And today, a battle unlike any before would unfold. Sergeant Korik, a towering galactic warlord from the mighty Shirixi Empire, stood at the center of the arena. His body was a symphony of muscle and scars, his alien features jagged and imposing, marked by the brutality of countless battles. His reputation had spread across the galaxy, a ruthless commander who never lost a fight. To him, combat was instinct, something as natural as breathing. The Shirixi people were known for their warlike nature, their endless conquest of planets, and their superiority in any battle. Standing opposite him, in stark contrast, was Cadet Felix Granger, a young human with a quick wit and an indomitable will. He was not a soldier by birth. He hadn't been trained since childhood to fight in the harshest conditions the galaxy had to offer. He was, however, a cadet in the Galactic Defense Corps, and he had earned his place not through raw power, but through his sharp mind and sheer persistence. Felix had heard the legends of Korik, the warlord who had wiped out entire fleets with nothing but his bare hands. But Felix had something that Korik had never faced before: humanity's resilience. Korik eyed Felix with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "A human cadet? This will be easy," he growled, his voice a low rumble. The galactic warlord was used to opponents who could match him in strength, speed, or even intellect, but humans? They were weak, insignificant ants in his eyes, just another species to crush beneath his boot. Felix, for his part, didn't flinch. His mind was racing, thinking through his limited options. He had trained for this day, though he had never expected to face Korik so soon. He had watched videos of the warlord's previous victories, read reports, and even studied his combat style. Korik was a beast of instinct, relying on brute force and aggression, with no regard for finesse or strategy. Felix, on the other hand, had been trained to think his way through challenges, to outsmart his opponents rather than overpower them. The arena's automated systems whirred to life, signaling the start of the match. "Engage!" came the cold, electronic voice, and just like that, the fight began. Felix's first instinct was to run, but he quickly realized that running from Korik wasn't an option. The warlord was fast, despite his massive size. In a blink, Korik charged, swinging a powerful, fist-sized gauntlet in Felix's direction. The sheer force of the blow created a shockwave, and Felix barely ducked in time, the air rippling with the wake of Korik's strike. Felix's heart raced, and sweat beaded on his forehead. This wasn't just a test of strength. It was a test of survival. For a moment, Felix hesitated. His mind flooded with doubts. He wasn't trained for this kind of raw combat. He wasn't even sure if his training was enough to withstand Korik's onslaught. But then, as the adrenaline kicked in, his instincts took over. Felix darted to the side, narrowly avoiding another crushing blow. He could feel the heat from the warlord's gauntlet as it passed inches from his face. Korik laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "Is that all you've got, human?" he taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. He moved in for another attack, faster this time, expecting Felix to falter. But Felix didn't falter. Instead, he leapt forward, using his agility to slip past Korik's defenses. He hadn't expected to outfight Korik in a battle of strength, but he had hoped to outwit him. In a split second, Felix spotted an opportunity. The warlord's massive fist was left wide open, and Felix didn't hesitate. He drove his elbow into Korik's exposed side, feeling the force of the impact reverberate through his arm. The blow wasn't strong enough to hurt Korik, but it created a small opening. It was enough to make Korik pause, just for a second. Korik growled in frustration, his temper flaring. "You're quicker than I expected, human. But speed won't save you," he roared, spinning around to face Felix. The warlord's eyes burned with fury, and his massive body seemed to swell with rage. Felix, his breath coming in ragged gasps, took a step back, his mind whirling. This wasn't just about defeating Korik. This was about surviving long enough to learn something. If he could outlast the Warlord, if he could push Korik into a situation where his brute strength couldn't carry him, perhaps he could find a way to win. The stakes were clear. If Felix lost, he would likely be crushed under the weight of the Warlord's power, his dreams of rising through the ranks of the Galactic Defense Corps shattered in an instant. But if he could somehow hold his ground, if he could survive this test, he would prove something much bigger than himself. He would prove that humans, despite their weaknesses, could stand shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Korik's eyes narrowed as he sized up his opponent. I underestimated you, human. But no amount of tricks will save you now. You'll fall just like all the others. Felix smiled, despite the fear that gripped his chest. We'll see about that, he muttered, readying himself for the next move. This fight wasn't over yet, and he wasn't about to back down. The tension in the arena grew thicker with each passing moment. The metallic clang of Korik's heavy steps reverberated across the vast training hall. Felix could feel the pulse of the lights above, each flicker heightening his senses. He was acutely aware of every movement, the rush of blood in his ears, the burn in his muscles as he fought to stay ahead of the Galactic Warlord's fury. Korik was relentless. His attacks came faster now, more unpredictable. Every swing of his massive gauntlet seemed like it could tear through the very fabric of the arena. Felix's mind raced, trying to calculate his next move, but each time he anticipated one attack, another followed. The Warlord was playing a game of attrition, forcing Felix to the edge of his endurance. Felix darted left, his feet barely making contact with the floor as he zipped past another blow. His heart pounded, his body screamed for respite, but there was no time to rest. Korik was everywhere. Felix barely had time to react before Korik launched a strike at his midsection, forcing him to roll sideways to avoid the brunt of it. The ground shook as Korik's gauntlet crashed into the floor with the power of a seismic blast. Felix's chest heaved as he scrambled back to his feet. He had no illusion of overpowering the Warlord. That was never going to happen. He couldn't match Korik in strength or size, but he could outthink him. Felix had to rely on his instincts and his training, and he had to do it quickly. In the back of his mind, Felix remembered his instructor's words. The best warriors don't fight the enemy they see, they fight the enemy they don't see. Use what you have, and the battlefield will reveal your strengths. Felix wasn't sure how he was going to outsmart Korik, but he had to start somewhere. The Warlord's brute force was not the problem, it was Korik's predictability. Felix faked left, anticipating that Korik would swing with his powerful gauntlet. Sure enough, the Warlord lunged with incredible speed, aiming to crush him with the same strike he'd already used twice before. But Felix wasn't there. Instead, he slid into the Warlord's blind spot, reaching for a nearby control panel hidden in the walls of the arena. He had no idea what it would do, but it was his best chance. As Felix activated the panel, a loud hum echoed through the arena. The lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, and the floor beneath them shifted. Korik paused, his eyes scanning the space for any advantage. What trickery is this? He snarled, his voice laced with suspicion. Felix didn't waste time responding. He dashed toward the newly revealed area of the arena, a section of the floor that now slid open to reveal a series of combat drones. These were not the standard security bots. These drones were equipped with adaptive algorithms and laser-based weapons. They were designed for one purpose: to take down any opponent, no matter their strength or skill. Felix wasn't sure how the Warlord would react, but he had a hunch. Korik was too proud, too focused on the one-on-one battle, to notice the impending threat from the drones. Felix's mind raced. He could control them for a short time, enough to throw Korik off balance. The drones surged forward, their sleek forms whirring with deadly purpose. They aimed their energy weapons at Korik, whose initial surprise quickly shifted to irritation. He swung his gauntlet to swat at the machines, but they were fast, too fast for him to strike with the same brute force he was accustomed to. One drone dodged to the left, firing a rapid shot that sent sparks flying off Korik's armor. He grunted in pain and swiped at the drone, but missed. The Warlord was now caught in a deadly dance, his massive frame struggling to keep up with the drone's agile movements. Felix, taking advantage of the chaos, began to reposition himself. This was the moment. The Warlord was distracted. Felix darted in, using his speed to get closer to Korik. The Warlord's eyes locked on him, and for a moment, Felix thought he'd be struck down for his audacity. But then, Korik's attention wavered, just long enough for Felix to make his move. Felix leapt onto one of the drones that had circled back, using the momentum to propel himself toward Korik. He grabbed hold of the Warlord's shoulder, pulling himself onto his back, just as the drones continued to swarm around them. Felix's fingers dug into Korik's armor, and for a brief moment, they were face to face, man to beast. "You underestimate us," Felix hissed, his voice low and steady. Korik's laughter rumbled beneath him. "What do you hope to do, human? You think you can defeat me with this trick?" His voice was scornful, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He twisted violently, trying to shake Felix off. Felix held on tight, trying to ignore the pain in his hands and arms as Korik threw him around like a ragdoll. Felix's eyes darted around, taking in the chaos of the drones and the Warlord's fury. He had to keep Korik off balance. He had to keep the Warlord distracted long enough to exploit a weakness. And there it was. As Korik swiped at a drone that came too close, Felix noticed the gap in the Warlord's armor around his side. With a burst of energy, Felix shifted his position and managed to land a sharp, precise blow into the exposed joint. The impact sent a shockwave through Korik's body. The Warlord staggered, momentarily thrown off balance, as the drones continued to fire, now focused on the weak point Felix had exposed. This was it, the shift had begun. Felix had struck the first real blow, and now, it was only a matter of time before the battle would turn in his favor. But he couldn't let his guard down. Korik's fury would only grow, and Felix still had a long way to go before he could claim victory. The Warlord roared in anger, spinning around to face his unexpected adversary. "You dare challenge me, human?" he bellowed, now truly enraged. "I will crush you like all the others." Felix didn't answer. Instead, he prepared himself for the next move, his only chance at survival. The roar of Korik's fury echoed through the training arena, reverberating off the steel walls and sending a ripple through the air. His massive frame twisted and turned as he tried to shake Felix off, but the human cadet held on with a ferocity that caught even the Warlord off guard. Felix could feel the intense heat of Korik's body, the raw power vibrating through his own frame as he clung desperately to the Warlord's back. His hands ached from gripping the jagged edges of the armor, but there was no time to feel pain, not now. His focus was singular: survive, outlast, and outthink the Warlord. Korik finally managed to wrench Felix from his back, tossing him aside like a rag doll. Felix hit the ground with a painful thud, but before he could recover, Korik was on him, towering like an unstoppable storm. The Warlord's massive foot came crashing down, aiming to pulverize Felix into the ground. Felix rolled to the side at the last possible moment, the ground shuddering as Korik's foot slammed into the floor, leaving a dent large enough to swallow a small vehicle. Felix's heart raced, but his mind was calm, calculating. He couldn't match Korik's sheer power. He had to outwit him, force him into a position where his brute strength couldn't win. The drones were still swarming around Korik, distracting him, but they were no longer enough to hold the Warlord back. Felix needed to change the game entirely. He spotted something useful: a large, industrial-grade cannon mounted on the far side of the arena. The cannon was meant to be used for high-energy target practice, but Felix had an idea. He couldn't get close enough to use it in the usual way, but perhaps he could leverage the surrounding environment to turn the cannon into a weapon Korik wouldn't expect. Felix dashed toward the cannon, knowing that every second mattered. His eyes flicked from Korik to the machinery, analyzing the way the controls were set up. He reached a control console, which would activate the cannon, but the moment he began to manipulate the system, he realized something. The Warlord was closing in on him, faster than Felix had anticipated. Korik's fury was palpable, his eyes narrowing as he zeroed in on his prey. But Felix wasn't intimidated. He had seen this before in simulations. Korik was predictable. His rage would cloud his judgment, and Felix knew he had only one chance to catch him off guard. Just as Korik's shadow loomed over him, Felix punched a series of commands into the control console. The cannon whirred to life, its massive barrel swiveling toward the center of the arena, where Korik stood just a few feet away. The Warlord was too focused on Felix to notice the change in the air until it was too late. "Die, human!" Korik bellowed, raising his gauntlet to deliver the final blow. Felix grinned and ducked, rolling out of the way as a high-energy beam shot from the cannon. The blast was far more powerful than Felix could have anticipated, and it shot past him with a blinding flash, catching Korik squarely in the chest. The Warlord let out a roar of shock and pain as the beam struck, sending him tumbling back with a force that shook the arena. Felix didn't have time to savor the moment. The cannon had done its job, but it was only a temporary distraction. Korik wasn't out of the fight yet. The Warlord rose slowly, shaking off the impact as his armor sparked and hissed from the energy blast. His breathing was heavy, his eyes glowing with a primal rage. He looked even more dangerous now, his pride wounded by Felix's ingenuity. "You think this is enough to stop me?" Korik's voice was low and menacing, and Felix could see the fury boiling beneath the surface. "You'll regret this, human." Felix's heart pounded as he took a quick step back. He was running out of time. He couldn't rely on the drones or the cannon anymore. Korik had adapted, and the Warlord was no longer just attacking out of anger, he was attacking with purpose. Felix had to think fast. In that moment of urgency, Felix's mind flicked to something else his instructors had taught him. The body is a weapon, but the mind is the shield. Always trust in your instincts. When all else fails, use what you have. Felix had an idea, but it would require more than just physical skill. It would take everything he had. He needed to create a situation where Korik was forced into a vulnerable position, where his pride and rage would work against him. As Korik charged again, Felix used his agility to slip behind a large structural column in the arena. The Warlord's steps shook the floor, his heavy footsteps shaking the walls as he closed in. Felix waited, his breathing steady, his muscles coiled like a spring. Then, just as Korik swung at the column with a devastating fist, Felix acted. He leapt out from behind the pillar, sprinting towards the far side of the arena. But this wasn't an escape, it was a trap. Korik's eyes flashed with recognition, but it was too late. The Warlord's fist struck the column, and Felix used the momentum of the impact to his advantage. As the column buckled from the force, a series of automated doors on the far side of the arena opened, revealing a hidden set of catwalks above. Felix scrambled up, his hands finding purchase on the slick metal as he scaled the structure. The Warlord followed, furious, but the high ground was an advantage. Felix could hear Korik's booming footsteps behind him as the Warlord climbed up, but he wasn't trying to escape. Instead, Felix was positioning himself in the perfect spot for what he hoped would be the final move. He didn't need to defeat Korik outright, he just needed to outmaneuver him. As Korik neared the top, Felix suddenly reversed direction, leaping onto a nearby platform that had been concealed by the arena's shifting architecture. The Warlord's heavy body struggled to adjust in the tight space. Felix grinned, knowing the Warlord's own power and pride were now working against him. Korik let out another frustrated roar, and for the first time in the fight, doubt flickered in his eyes. Felix had taken control of the battlefield. He had turned Korik's own aggression into his downfall. "You've made a mistake, human," Korik hissed, but his voice now held a trace of hesitation. Felix's grin widened. "I don't think so," he said, his voice calm but confident. He was ready for the next move. Korik's heavy breathing echoed through the arena as he struggled to adjust to the high ground, his massive form a contrast to the agile human cadet now standing above him, looking down with calculated precision. For the first time since their battle began, Korik seemed unsure of himself. The Warlord's usual confidence was fading, eroded by the human's unexpected tactics and relentless determination. He had underestimated Felix, and now, with every calculated move, The cadet was proving just how dangerous Earth's unlikely hero could be. The warlord's fists clenched, his armor creaking under the strain as he stared up at Felix. His eyes blazed with fury, but there was a flicker of something else there too, respect. It was the smallest of acknowledgments, but Felix saw it. "You've earned my attention, human," Korik growled, his voice now tinged with an unspoken challenge. "But it will take more than tricks and quick thinking to defeat me." Felix didn't respond immediately. He was watching, waiting, reading Korik's every movement. He had no intention of playing the warlord's game by brute force. The power was never in muscle, it was in the mind, in strategy, and in knowing when to strike. Felix's mind raced, trying to figure out his next move, when suddenly, something unexpected happened. The arena itself shifted. The massive walls groaned as they began to retract, revealing a new environment. The floor was slowly being reconfigured into a dangerous, craggy landscape, complete with steep cliffs and narrow walkways. Felix's eyes flicked up to the walls, realizing that this was a part of the simulation's final phase, an arena designed to push the combatants to their limits, turning the landscape into a hostile, ever-changing battleground. The ground trembled as Korik roared in frustration. He had been caught off guard by the sudden change in terrain, but now it was clear to both combatants that the stakes had been raised. There was no longer any room for hesitation or second guesses. Korik lunged, his weight and power crashing down like an avalanche, but Felix was already on the move. Felix had learned enough to know that his physical limitations would never allow him to win a straight-up fight against the warlord. But if Korik was to fall, it would be by Felix's ingenuity, not his strength. He darted between the shifting rocks and steep cliffs, using the environment to his advantage. The rocks were treacherous, but they were also the perfect cover, offering places to hide and maneuver. The warlord's size and power worked against him in this new landscape, and Felix capitalized on that weakness. Felix's eyes locked onto the high ledge above him, a narrow ridge running along the edge of the arena. With Korik still hot on his heels, Felix didn't hesitate. He sprang into action, leaping across the jagged rocks with the precision of a seasoned warrior. His hands grasped a protruding edge, and with one fluid motion, he swung himself onto the ridge, positioning himself above the warlord. Korik roared in frustration, his massive fists smashing into the rocks below as he tried to reach Felix. But the human cadet was faster, more nimble, and much more adaptable. Felix moved with lightning speed, staying one step ahead of the warlord's fury. He had learned to use his size, his agility, and his quick thinking as his greatest advantages. Korik's sheer power no longer intimidated him. Felix spotted an overhead structure, an industrial crane, part of the arena's shifting architecture, that had been left behind from earlier in the simulation. It was a precarious piece of equipment, but it was just the tool Felix needed. The warlord had no chance of climbing up there, and Felix saw an opportunity to end the fight decisively. He had a plan. Felix's fingers worked quickly, pressing buttons on a control panel that had been left behind by the arena's automated systems. The crane began to move, its mechanical arms whirring to life. Felix wasn't aiming for Korik directly, he was aiming for the environment itself. He needed to create a situation where Korik's arrogance and rage would be his undoing. As Felix manipulated the crane, a massive block of steel and debris began to shift from its resting position, suspended high above the warlord's head. Korik, oblivious to the danger, was too focused on Felix to notice what was happening. Felix had him right where he wanted him. With a smirk, Felix triggered the crane's release mechanism. The heavy steel block began to plummet toward the ground, but the moment it dropped, Korik's eyes flicked up in realization. He only had a split second to react, but it was too late. The block slammed down with tremendous force, knocking Korik off his feet and sending him sprawling across the uneven ground. His roar of rage turned into one of shock as the impact sent him careening into a cluster of jagged rocks. Felix jumped down, landing lightly on his feet, surveying the damage. Korik was on the ground, dazed but still alive. His armor was dented and scorched from the blast, and he struggled to regain his bearings. The warlord's fury was still evident, but Felix knew that the battle had reached its turning point. "You've learned well, human," Korik said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. He slowly got to his feet, his breathing labored. "But know this, your victory here does not mean you have bested me. It means you've earned the right to survive." Felix stood tall, his chest heaving from the exertion, but his expression was calm. "I didn't need to best you," he said, a grin tugging at his lips. "I just needed to outsmart you." Korik's eyes narrowed, but there was no more malice in his gaze. Instead, there was a reluctant respect, a realization that, for all his strength, he had been defeated not by physical power, but by the ingenuity of an Earth cadet. And in that moment, Korik understood the true meaning of Felix's victory. The warlord gave a slow, begrudging nod, a warrior's acknowledgement. "You are more than a mere human. You have proven yourself today." Felix smiled, the weight of the battle slowly lifting from his shoulders. He had won, not just because of his skill, but because he had embraced the one thing that made him truly dangerous: his mind. As he stood there, facing the warlord who had once been certain of his own supremacy, Felix knew that this moment would echo far beyond the arena. It wasn't just about survival. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated.